December 23rd, 2000. Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles. The house sits silent at the end of a quiet residential street. Christmas lights blink from neighboring windows. A wreath hangs on the door next door. Inside 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive, nothing moves. Susan Berman had been expecting a visitor. She had been making calls, writing notes. She had told at least 2 people, in the weeks prior, that she was frightened, that someone was watching, that something was coming. The body was found by a friend. Single gunshot wound, execution style, to the back of the skull. Clean, deliberate, professional. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Whoever killed Susan Berman, she had let them in. For 17 years, the case went nowhere. No arrest, no conviction, no official explanation. The Los Angeles Police Department logged it as a robbery gone wrong, despite the fact that nothing had been taken. Then a wire was fitted, a letter was traced, and a name surfaced, a name already attached to 1 disappearance, 1 suspicious death, and 1 cold case spanning 3 decades. Robert Durst. The heir to a New York real estate dynasty, a man who had been present at, or proximate to, every major catastrophe in Susan Berman's adult life. This is not a story about a robbery. This is a story about what happens when a witness knows too much and a killer runs out of patience. To understand why Susan Berman died, you must first understand what she was born into. Not poverty, not obscurity, power. Her father was Davie Berman, one of the most consequential organized crime figures in mid-century America. Not a street enforcer, not a low-level earner, an architect, a builder of criminal infrastructure at the highest level. Davie Berman ran Las Vegas before Las Vegas was legal. He was a corps lieutenant in the Meyer Lansky syndicate, the financial brain trust behind the national crime syndicate's westward expansion. When Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo Hotel hemorrhaged money and Siegel himself became a liability, it was men like Davie Berman who stepped in to stabilize the operation. To keep the money moving, to keep the peace. Susan grew up inside that world, not as an outsider looking in, but as a daughter of it. She knew what her father was. She understood, even as a child, the unspoken protocols. You do not speak to authorities. You do not ask questions you don't need answered. You protect the people who protect you. When Davie Berman died in 1957, on an operating table during open-heart surgery, Susan just 9 years old, he left her no money, no estate, no inheritance to speak of. What he left her was a name, and in certain rooms, that name carried weight that no bank account could replicate. She grew up brilliant. She attended UCLA. She became a writer, a press agent, a journalist, a woman who understood narrative, who understood how stories were shaped and controlled. She understood, better than most, the difference between the official version and the truth. Robert Durst came from a different kind of dynasty entirely. His father, Seymour Durst, built one of the most powerful real estate empires in New York City history. Midtown Manhattan. Prime commercial corridors. Billions, before the word billion was common currency in civilian conversation. But Robert was not Seymour's chosen heir. That distinction, that deliberate exclusion, would define Robert Durst's psychology for the rest of his life. Here was a man raised inside extraordinary wealth, trained by proximity to power, yet consistently passed over, sidelined, rendered peripheral within his own family structure. Susan Berman and Robert Durst met at UCLA in the 1960s. 2 people, 2 dynasties. Both defined by fathers they could never fully escape. Their friendship was not incidental. It was structural. Each recognized in the other something they had learned to conceal from the world, the particular loneliness of inheriting a world you did not choose and could not leave. That friendship would last 30 years, It would end with a bullet. Las Vegas in the 1940s and 1950s was not a city. It was a project. A deliberate construction, engineered by organized crime to function as a legitimate revenue engine for the national crime syndicate. The desert was chosen precisely because it was empty. Because federal jurisdiction was thin. Because local politicians were affordable. Meyer Lansky understood something that most criminal minds of his era did not, that the future of organized crime was not in violence. It was in infrastructure, in hotels, in casinos, in the laundering of illegal capital through legitimate commercial enterprise. Davie Berman was one of the men Lansky trusted to execute that vision. He had earned that trust through decades of demonstrated loyalty, running numbers operations in Minneapolis, managing syndicate interests across the Midwest, absorbing arrests without cooperation. He was disciplined. He was discreet. He understood that in the criminal hierarchy, the most valuable currency was not money. It was silence. When the Flamingo faltered after Siegel's 1947 assassination, Davie Berman moved in. Alongside Gus Greenbaum, he restructured the casino's operations, stabilized its finances, and transformed it into a functioning profit center for syndicate investors stretching from New York to Chicago to Miami. This was not low-level work. This was the inner architecture of American organized crime at its most sophisticated. The precise moment when the mob stopped thinking like gangsters and started thinking like corporations. Susan Berman absorbed all of it, not through formal education, through proximity, through dinner-table silences, through the men who moved through her father's world, their careful language, their calibrated loyalty, their absolute understanding that certain relationships were permanent. You did not exit the structure. You served it, or you suffered the consequences of its displeasure. She would later write about her father in a memoir, Easy Street, with a clarity that surprised critics. She did not romanticize him. She did not condemn him. She rendered him with precision, a man fully formed by the world he had chosen and fully aware of its costs. That capacity for clear-eyed witness was her greatest professional strength. It was also, ultimately, what made her dangerous. Robert Durst had no equivalent inheritance of loyalty. His world, Manhattan real estate, board meetings, inheritance disputes, operated by different codes. Power there was expressed through exclusion, through legal instruments, through the quiet withdrawal of access and approval. But he had spent 30 years watching Susan Berman navigate the world with a confidence that came from knowing exactly where she stood within a structure larger than herself. When that structure began to close around him, when the questions about his missing wife began to multiply, he turned to the one person who had been raised to understand what silence required. Susan Berman did not hesitate. She provided Robert Durst with an alibi. She spoke to investigators on his behalf. She inserted herself between him and the growing pressure of a police inquiry that, had it proceeded without interference, might have ended very differently. She protected him the way her father had taught her to protect people. Completely. Without condition, she did not yet understand what that loyalty would eventually cost her. January 31st, 1982. South Salem, New York. Kathie Durst was 29 years old. She was a medical student. Intelligent, driven, by multiple accounts deeply unhappy inside a marriage that had calcified into something resembling a controlled environment rather than a partnership. She had confided in friends, in classmates, in at least one faculty member at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where she was enrolled. She told them she was afraid of her husband. On the night of January 31st, Robert Durst later claimed, he drove Kathie to a train station in Katonah, New York. She boarded a train to Manhattan, he said. She disappeared into the city. She was never seen again. No body was ever recovered. The official investigation that followed was, by any rigorous standard, a failure. The Durst family's legal resources were considerable. Their connections within New York's political and financial establishment ran deep. The initial inquiry moved slowly, generated no arrests, and eventually collapsed under the weight of its own procedural inadequacy. What it left behind was a silence, official, institutional, deliberately maintained. But silences of that magnitude require active management. Someone had to speak to investigators and redirect their attention. Someone had to confirm timelines, corroborate accounts, provide the social scaffolding that transforms a suspicious disappearance into an inconclusive cold case. Susan Berman provided that scaffolding. The precise nature of her involvement would not become fully documented until decades later. But prosecutors would eventually argue, and a jury would ultimately agree, that Susan Berman's intervention in the immediate aftermath of Kathie's disappearance was not incidental. It was coordinated. She knew Robert Durst's account was constructed. She helped sustain it regardless. This is the moment the documentary must linger on, not because it is dramatic, but because it is diagnostic. It reveals the precise mechanism by which intelligent people become complicit in serious crimes. Susan Berman did not pull a trigger in 1982. She made a calculation. Robert was her closest friend. He was, in the emotional vocabulary of her upbringing, family, and family was the one category of relationship that superseded all others. The protocols her father had modeled were unambiguous. You protect the people inside your circle. You do not hand them to authorities. You absorb the cost of loyalty quietly and without complaint. What she could not have fully calculated, what perhaps no rational person could have fully anticipated, was that Robert Durst was not operating by the same codes. Her father's world had rules. Brutal rules, yes, but rules nonetheless. Robert Durst operated by something altogether different. He operated by the logic of elimination. Kathie had become a problem. She was removed. Susan had become a witness. She had been useful. For nearly 2 decades, she had been useful. The moment she ceased to be useful, the same logic would apply. She would not see it coming. Not because she was naive. Susan Berman was many things, but naive was not among them. She would not see it coming, because she still believed, at the deepest level of her psychology, that loyalty was a contract, that what she had given would be honored in return. She was wrong. Westchester County, New York, late 1999. 17 years had passed since Kathie Durst vanished. 17 years of institutional silence. 17 years of a cold case file gathering bureaucratic dust inside a county police department that had, by every available measure, declined to pursue the investigation with anything resembling adequate resources or political will. Then a new Westchester County District Attorney took office. Jeanine Pirro. Whatever her subsequent political trajectory, her decision to reopen the Kathie Durst investigation in 1999 was consequential. She assigned investigators. She allocated resources. She began the methodical process of re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining evidence, and reconstructing a timeline that the original inquiry had left deliberately incomplete. The investigation gained traction quickly. Former friends of Kathie Durst came forward. Medical school colleagues provided statements. A picture emerged, not of a spontaneous disappearance, but of a marriage defined by control, isolation, and escalating violence. Kathie had told people, multiple people, across multiple years. She had been afraid. The reinvestigation created immediate pressure on Robert Durst. His legal team mobilized. His public posture shifted. He began, by accounts of people close to him during this period, to exhibit the behavioral signatures of a man who understood that the architecture of concealment he had maintained for nearly 2 decades was developing structural fractures. He reached out to Susan Berman. The precise content of those communications remains partially reconstructed through prosecution evidence and testimony. But the trajectory is documentable. As the Westchester investigation intensified, the contact between Durst and Berman increased in frequency and urgency. Susan, by this point, was in serious financial difficulty. Her career had plateaued. Her Hollywood connections had thinned. The inheritance she had never received from her father's estate left her dependent on a network of personal relationships rather than institutional security. Robert Durst had, over the years, provided her with financial support, tens of thousands of dollars, transferred with the quiet regularity of a man maintaining a resource he intended to keep available. That financial dependency was not incidental. It was, prosecutors would later argue, structural. It was the mechanism by which Robert Durst ensured Susan Berman's continued cooperation, not through explicit threat, but through the more sophisticated instrument of obligation. You do not betray the person who keeps your lights on. But obligation has a ceiling. In late 2000, Susan Berman made contact with a writer, a journalist with whom she had discussed, in broad terms, the possibility of a book. A book that would address, among other subjects, the Kathie Durst disappearance. A book that would require her to speak with a degree of candor she had never previously permitted herself. Whether she intended to fully disclose what she knew, whether she had resolved, finally, to step outside the protocols her father had modeled, remains a matter of interpretive dispute. What is not disputed is this. Someone sent a letter to the Beverly Hills Police Department shortly before Susan Berman's body was discovered. The letter was anonymous. It directed police to her address. It used a specific spelling, cadaver, that would later be matched, through forensic analysis, to correspondence confirmed as originating from Robert Durst. He did not simply kill her. He notified the authorities afterward, anonymously, carefully, to ensure the body would be found without the discovery being traced back to him. That single detail reveals something essential about Robert Durst's psychology. This was not passion. This was not panic. This was administration. The management of a problem through the same cold procedural logic he had applied to every crisis in his life. The logic of a man raised inside institutional power, who had learned that consequences could always be navigated if you remained sufficiently composed. Susan Berman had spent her life understanding power structures. She did not fully understand the one that had been closing around her. Los Angeles, autumn 2000. In the final weeks of her life, Susan Berman was not the composed, socially connected woman her public persona suggested. She was frightened, not in the abstract, generalized way that people describe in retrospect to lend narrative coherence to tragedy. Specifically, concretely frightened, the kind of fear that produces behavioral changes visible to people in close proximity. She told friends she was being watched. She made calls at unusual hours. She was distracted in conversations, prone to long silences, to abrupt subject changes that suggested a mind continuously returning to something it could not resolve. She was also, by multiple accounts, wrestling with something that had no clean name in the vocabulary available to her. Guilt is too simple a word. What Susan Berman appeared to be experiencing in those final weeks was the particular psychological torment of a person who has spent decades maintaining a version of events, has built her identity, in part, around the maintenance of that version, and has finally begun to understand the full weight of what that maintenance required. She had protected Robert Durst for nearly 20 years. She had absorbed the moral cost of that protection by framing it within the language of loyalty she had inherited from her father's world. Loyalty was a value. Loyalty was identity. Loyalty was the one currency that did not depreciate. But the Westchester reinvestigation had introduced a variable her father's protocols had never anticipated. Kathie Durst had a family, sisters, people who had never stopped asking questions, people who had engaged their own investigators, retained their own legal counsel, and were now, 20 years later, closer to the truth than anyone had been before. Susan had met Kathie. She had known her, however peripherally, as a human being rather than an abstraction. That knowledge, suppressed for 2 decades, was surfacing. The journalist conversations, the book discussions, the careful oblique language she used when addressing the subject with people she trusted, all of it pointed toward a woman moving, incrementally and perhaps unconsciously, toward disclosure. Robert Durst was watching. He had always been watching. The financial support he provided was not generosity. It was surveillance infrastructure, a mechanism that kept Susan Berman within his orbit, dependent on his goodwill, visible to his attention. When her behavior shifted, he registered it immediately. He understood, with the cold clarity that defined his psychology, what the shift meant. She was no longer fully controllable. In his architecture of self-preservation, that conclusion had only one logical endpoint. He booked a flight to Los Angeles, 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive, Los Angeles, December 23, 2000. The day before Christmas Eve. The neighborhood was quiet in the particular way that residential Los Angeles becomes quiet during the holiday period. A stillness that is not peaceful but vacant. The stillness of a city that has temporarily retreated indoors. Susan Berman was home. She had no reason to suspect the visit was terminal. That is the detail that resists easy comprehension. Not the mechanics of what followed, but the psychological architecture that preceded it. She opened the door. She admitted the person who would kill her. She did so without alarm, without resistance, without any visible indication that the protocols of self-preservation had engaged, because they had not. You do not activate survival instincts against the person you have spent 20 years protecting. The human mind does not easily reconfigure a relationship of that duration and emotional density into a threat assessment. Robert Durst understood that. He had counted on it. The forensic evidence reconstructed by prosecution investigators was precise and unambiguous in its clinical details. Susan Berman was shot once. A single bullet, fired at close range, delivered to the back of the skull. Execution style. The term is used so frequently in true crime narration that it has lost much of its original weight. Restored to its literal meaning, it describes something specific and deliberate, a method of killing that eliminates struggle, minimizes noise, and ensures immediate incapacitation. It is not a crime of passion. It requires the perpetrator to position themselves behind a person who is not resisting. It requires them to raise a weapon against someone who, in that moment, presents no threat. It requires a particular quality of psychological compartmentalization, the capacity to sever, completely and instantaneously, the emotional content of a relationship from the operational requirements of its termination. Robert Durst had performed that severance. Susan Berman, the daughter of Davie Berman, the woman who had grown up understanding power structures and their costs, who had written with clinical precision about her father's world and its protocols, died without knowing she had been assessed, categorized, and scheduled. She died, in all probability, believing she was among friends. The house was left undisturbed. Nothing was taken. No drawers opened. No surfaces searched. The staging of a robbery, the minimum theater required to misdirect an investigation, was not even attempted, because it was not necessary. Robert Durst had already dispatched the letter to the Beverly Hills Police Department. The anonymous notification, the careful spelling, the administrative tidiness of a man who understood that discovered bodies generate less investigative momentum than missing persons, and who had, on at least one prior occasion, experienced the institutional inertia that follows an inconclusive disappearance. He left Los Angeles. The Christmas lights continued blinking in neighboring windows. The wreath remained on the door next door. Inside 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive, Susan Berman lay on the floor of her home, alone, undiscovered, in the silence that her loyalty had finally purchased for her. The years that followed did not move in a straight line. They rarely do when institutional power and personal wealth intersect with criminal investigation. They move in circles, slow, expensive, procedurally exhausting circles that favor the resource-rich and punish the persistent. Robert Durst was extraordinarily resource-rich. Within months of Susan Berman's murder, the Westchester reinvestigation into Kathie Durst's disappearance had identified him as its primary subject of interest. The pressure was sufficient to produce a response, not confession, not surrender, but flight. Robert Durst disappeared. He resurfaced in Galveston, Texas, living under an assumed identity, presenting himself as a mute woman named Dorothy Senior, occupying a low-rent rooming house in a coastal city where no one knew his name or his history. It was an extraordinary act of self-erasure for a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was also, in retrospect, deeply revealing. In Galveston, his neighbor was Morris Black, an elderly, cantankerous man with whom Durst developed the kind of proximate, transactional relationship that inevitably forms between people sharing thin walls and limited options. In September 2001, Morris Black was killed. His dismembered body parts were discovered floating in Galveston Bay, recovered across multiple days, distributed across a considerable geographic radius. His head was never found. Robert Durst was arrested. What followed was one of the most extraordinary criminal trial outcomes in modern American legal history. Durst admitted to killing Morris Black. He claimed self-defense, that a struggle over a gun had ended with Black's death, and that he had subsequently dismembered the body and disposed of it in a state of panic. The jury acquitted him of murder, convicted him only of evidence tampering, the dismemberment and disposal itself. He walked out of a Texas courtroom, having admitted to dismembering a human body, and served no meaningful prison time for the act. The verdict sent a message that reverberated through every cold case connected to his name, a message about what sufficient legal resources could accomplish inside a system that, whatever its theoretical commitments to equality, operated in practice along the familiar lines of wealth and access. For years, the cases stalled. Then came the filmmakers. Andrew Jarecki's documentary series, The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, represented a different category of investigative pressure. Not institutional, not procedural, cinematic. The kind of sustained, publicly visible narrative construction that generates its own momentum independent of official channels. Durst agreed to participate. That decision, made, one must assume, from a position of characteristic confidence in his own capacity to control a narrative, proved to be the decisive miscalculation of his life. The filmmakers discovered a letter Robert Durst had written to Susan Berman years before her death. The handwriting, the spelling, the specific idiosyncratic rendering of the word Beverly as Beverly matched precisely to the anonymous letter sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department directing them to Susan Berman's body. Same hand, same spelling, same author. When confronted with this evidence during filming, Robert Durst excused himself to use the restroom. He did not realize his microphone was still active. What he said, alone in that bathroom, believing himself unobserved, the muttered, fragmented, almost involuntary confession that emerged, became the most devastating piece of self-incrimination in the history of documentary filmmaking. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course. He was arrested in 2015, tried for the murder of Susan Berman, convicted in 2021 by a Los Angeles jury after one of the longest and most procedurally complex trials in California history. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
Robert Durst died in prison on January 9, 2022. He never formally confessed to killing Kathie Durst. Her case remains officially unsolved. Returned to Benedict Canyon, December 23, 2000. The Christmas lights are still blinking. The wreath is still on the door next door. And inside that house, in that silence, is the answer to the question this story has been building toward. Not who killed Susan Berman, because we know that now, but why the machinery that should have prevented it failed so completely for so long, at every level at which it was tested.
The answer is not complicated. It is, in fact, ancient. Power does not merely corrupt, it insulates. It builds, layer by careful layer, a structural distance between the people who possess it and the consequences that attach to everyone else. Robert Durst did not evade accountability for 3 decades because he was exceptionally intelligent, though he was intelligent. He evaded it because every institution designed to constrain him, law enforcement, the judiciary, the social infrastructure of wealth and reputation, performed, at critical moments, exactly as institutions perform when significant resources are applied to their pressure points. They bent. Susan Berman understood this dynamic better than almost anyone. She had been raised inside it. She had watched her father operate within it. She had written about it with the clear, unsentimental precision of someone who had never permitted herself the luxury of pretending that official versions and actual truths were reliably the same thing. And yet she became its casualty, not because she was ignorant of the risks, but because the one blind spot in her otherwise forensic understanding of power was personal. She believed that the loyalty she extended would be recognized as the extraordinary thing it was, that a man who had received 20 years of absolute protection from a woman who owed him nothing would understand, at some fundamental level, what that protection had cost her. She was operating by her father's codes in a world that had moved past them. Davie Berman's world, brutal as it was, contained a reciprocal logic. You protected the structure, and the structure protected you. Loyalty was transactional in the deepest sense, not mercenary, but mutual. It created obligation in both directions. Robert Durst recognized no such obligation. He was not a product of that world. He was a product of a different and in some ways colder architecture, the architecture of inherited institutional power, where other people exist primarily as instruments, where loyalty is a resource to be consumed rather than a contract to be honored, where the elimination of inconvenient witnesses is simply another form of asset management. Susan Berman spent her life writing about power. She spent her final weeks circling, incrementally, toward the most important story she had ever known. She never got to write it. That is the thesis this story delivers, not as abstraction, but as lived consequence. The most dangerous thing a witness can possess is not evidence. Evidence can be challenged, suppressed, procedurally neutralized. The most dangerous thing a witness can possess is a conscience that has finally, after years of strategic dormancy, begun to wake. Robert Durst understood that. He had always understood that. And on a quiet street in Benedict Canyon, 2 days before Christmas, while the neighborhood slept and the lights blinked and the world moved through its ordinary business entirely unaware, he acted on that understanding with the same cold administrative precision he had applied to every crisis of his life. The lights kept blinking. They always do. That is the most unsettling truth this story leaves behind. Not that monsters exist within systems of power, but that systems of power are, by their nature, designed to accommodate them, to absorb their crimes, to process their victims through bureaucratic channels that generate paperwork without producing justice. Susan Berman knew that. She knew it from birth. In the end, it did not save her.